Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Munich Dialogues on Democracy. Welcome to everybody here in the theater, and welcome to those of you joining us online as well. This partnership behind the program is a partnership between the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's amerikahaus. My name is Bartley Grosserichter. I'm the current president of the Yale Club of Germany. So in the name of amerikahaus and the Yale Club, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us tonight. This is... Thank you. As we've talked about, this is a really unusual mega election year. There are over 70 elections happening around the world, and we have a really strong program to help us all make sense of it. If you remember, so far this year, we've spent an evening focused on the United States and Joe Biden's White House with Franklin Furr. And then we heard about angry populist politics around the world with Yale's Ian Shapiro. And just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about polarization and defending democracy in the cybersphere with Yael Eisenstadt. And just this Tuesday, we had our very first Dialogues on Democracy book group. So it is a real pleasure to finally be able to welcome our guest tonight. I say finally because between scheduling conflicts and COVID, we've been working on making this happen for a couple of years. I've had that picture in my computer for a long time. So when we started Munich Dialogues on Democracy in 2018, a book came out called How Democracies Die. It shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and it did the same on the Spiegel bestseller list when it came out in German. It has since been translated into over 30 languages and won numerous prestigious prizes. Written by two Harvard professors, Stephen Levitsky and our guest tonight, Daniel Ziblatt, it came out during the Trump presidency and the rise of populism around the world, and it describes the dangers of both to democracy. At the time, they wrote, quote, "If 25 years ago, someone had described to you a country in which candidates threatened to lock up their rivals, political opponents accused the government of stealing the election or establishing a dictatorship, and parties used their legislative majorities to impeach presidents and steal Supreme Court seats, you might have thought of Ecuador or Romania. You probably would not have thought of the United States. But here we are." Daniel Ziblatt is Eaton Professor of the Science of Government at Harvard University, and since October 2020, the Director of the Department Transformations of Democracy. He's been the recipient of the 2019 Berlin Prize from the American Academy in Berlin, and he has served as a Karl W. Deutsch Visiting Professor at the WZB, the Berlin Social Science Center, and in 2023, he was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The list goes on and on and on. In the interest of getting to our event tonight, his latest book is called Tyranny of the Minority, and it appeared in fall 2023 in English, and this week it has been released in German, I think just yesterday. In it, the authors draw on a wealth of examples from 1930s France to present-day Thailand to explain why and how political parties turn against democracy. They then show how the United States Constitution makes it uniquely vulnerable to attacks from within. It's a dangerous enabler of minority rule, allowing partisan minorities to consistently thwart and even rule over majorities. So societal diversity, cultural backlash, and extreme right parties are everywhere across Western democracies. But only in America did such extremists actually win control of the national government and assault democratic institutions. Why did America, alone among rich established democracies, come to the brink, and could it happen elsewhere? We'll know better in a few minutes. We'll be using Slido.com tonight, as always, so if you want to ask questions, just go to Slido.com, put in #amerikahaus, and your questions will come up to the iPad in the front. After Daniel's talk, I'll join him on stage, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So please join me in giving a warm Munich Willkommen to Daniel Ziblatt.
Wonderful to be here. As Bartley said, back in 2018 when my book, How Democracies Die, came out, I was in Munich for the summer, and this program wasn't actually quite running yet, so otherwise I would have spoken that. So it's really great to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everybody for coming this evening. So I'm going to talk about the book that's just come out. Back in 2018, we wrote this book, How Democracies Die, with my colleague Steve Levitsky, thinking that there was the possibility that America might be headed to a democratic crisis. And so we wrote that book really with the idea that we wanted to send a warning to fellow citizens and to others that it could happen in the United States. That when political leaders advertise their authoritarianism when they're running on the campaign trail, that this usually is a sign that things might go wrong once they're in office. So that book really described the process of democratic breakdown generally, drawing on lessons from other parts of the world. I've spent most of my career studying European democracies, my co-author Latin American democracies, and drawing on other historical periods and other countries, we wanted to, again, understand what might happen in the United States. Now, after we wrote that book, over the next several years, we went around speaking to audiences like this, and inevitably people would ask us, well, what can we do about it? Especially, we would speak to public libraries, civic groups, and so on in the United States. People would say, what can we do about this? It's one thing to diagnose this, to say that this could happen. What can we do about it? So this book really is an attempt to answer that question by doing a deeper dive into American politics, American history, to try to understand why things have gone wrong in order to help us try to understand how we can get out. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'll have some reflections, I think, on there are lessons, I think, from the American experience for European democracy, so we're sort of coming back to that at the end. But I really want to focus primarily on the United States this evening, because I think there's many people, including myself, who sort of feel deeply in our bones that things could go wrong in November 2024. And so we want to kind of figure out how did we get here, how can we get out? Now, I thought I would begin actually with some numbers, some data. The international organization Freedom House every year produces a global freedom index. It assigns a score of 0 to 100 for every democracy around the world, ranking them. If you get a higher score, you're a better democracy, a lower score, a lower performing democracy. A decade ago, the United States received a score of 94 out of 100, which put it on par with the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany. And this is really where the U.S. had sat for decades. Today, the U.S. Freedom House score is 83, tied with Romania, and 2 points behind Argentina. Now, this usually shocks people, but when you have government efforts to restrict voting, when you have an incumbent president who tries to block a transfer of power, and when you have repeated systematic efforts to suppress the vote across states, then you reach a point where Freedom House scores you lower than Argentina. Now, falling from 94 to 83 from 2016 to 2021, the American political system has experienced what political scientists call democratic backsliding. Now, this hasn't experienced severe democratic backsliding of the sort that has hit Hungary or Turkey or even India, but all major democratic indices have registered a pretty significant decline in the level of U.S. democracy since 2016. So how in the world did the U.S. end up here? And this is really puzzling from a social scientific point of view. I'm a political scientist, because social scientists and political scientists disagree about most things, but there's two basic rock-solid findings that most political scientists agree on. Number one, that rich democracies don't die. No country with a GDP per capita of above $17,000 has ever experienced democratic backsliding, at least in the 20th century into the 21st century. The U.S. is 4 times that level. The second seemingly rock-solid finding is that old democracies never die. No democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down in this same time period. So even if we date the birth of American democracy in the 1960s, which I think is the right way to think about American democracy, when civil rights and voting rights were extended to all Americans, the American democracy is over the age of 50. So the crisis that American democracy finds itself in, it represents a genuine puzzle. And that puzzle is that unique among peer nations, among other rich old democracies of Western Europe, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, Netherlands, Scandinavia, and East Asia, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, unique among this cluster of countries, the U.S. has experienced democratic backsliding. So I'm going to provide an explanation tonight of why that has happened. I'm going to focus broadly on 2 broad culprits. The first is the radicalization of one of America's political parties, the Republican Party. And the second is a set of political institutions that are arguably making the problem worse. So I'm going to talk about each in turn. Now, the first challenge facing American democracy today is an authoritarian turn within one of our 2 major political parties, the Republican Party. Democracy can't survive if one of its major parties is not committed to playing by democratic rules. Now, I want to be very clear here what I mean when I say a party turns away from democracy, because a skeptic might, of course, ask, isn't this just all in the eye of the beholder? Don't we just call the opposite side authoritarian? And in fact, that is a more and more common experience within the United States today. And I think this is not actually quite right. It's actually possible to identify specific criteria by which one can judge a political party and how committed to democracy it is. So in our book, we propose a set of criteria drawing on criteria developed by a great and famous Yale political scientist, Juan Linz, for those of you from the Yale Club here, a Spanish political scientist who taught at Yale for many, many years, who was born in Spain during the Civil War era. And what he identified is a set of criteria that we elaborate in our book to identify when a political party is committed to democracy or not. What he essentially said is that a loyal Democratic Party or a loyal Democratic politician must do three things. First of all, they must unambiguously accept the results of elections, win or lose. Second, they must not use violence when trying to gain power or try to stay in power. And third, and this is a little bit more complicated perhaps, they must break completely with anti-democratic extremists within their own camp. Now that third point is particularly interesting because individual leaders can't kill a democracy on their own. They need accomplices among mainstream politicians. These are, again, what the great political scientist Linz called semi-loyalists. Semi-loyalists are hard to pick out in a crowd. They look and talk like normal democratic politicians. But the key difference between a semi-loyal politician, semi-loyal to democracy, and a loyal Democrat is how they respond to authoritarian threats within their own camp. When anti-democratic extremists emerge in either right or left, within the flank of mainstream political parties, loyal Democrats do three things. First, they condemn anti-democratic behavior publicly. Second, they expel anti-democratic extremists from their own ranks, refusing to nominate them or support their candidacies. And crucially, they join forces with pro-democratic forces that may be their political rivals on the other side of the aisle to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremists. Now, semi-loyalists do none of these things. Rather than publicly repudiating anti-democratic behavior on their own flank, they downplay it or they justify it. Rather than expelling anti-democratic extremists, semi-loyalists tolerate and even accommodate them. And crucially, semi-loyalists don't work with ideological rivals across the aisle to defeat anti-democratic extremists within their own ranks. They choose their anti-democratic allies within their own ranks over pro-democratic rivals, even when democracy is on the line. Now, the tragedy of semi-loyalty and semi-loyal politicians is that the men and women who are semi-loyal politicians often aren't trying to kill democracy. They're just ordinary politicians trying to get ahead. They're trying to stave off a primary challenge, or they're trying to become the committee chairperson or the Speaker of the House of Representatives. But semi-loyal behavior strengthens anti-democratic forces. Because when mainstream politicians tolerate or condone anti-democratic extremism, it normalizes extremism. Major media outlets start to treat anti-democratic forces as ordinary politicians. Political donors who want to contribute to political campaigns who once shunned extremists might think, well, okay, it's okay. Leading consultants and pollsters start to return the phone calls of anti-democratic extremists. And of course, voters begin to take them more seriously. Now, a crucial lesson that we try to draw in our book, when we look at democratic breakdowns in the 1920s and 30s in Europe and the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, is that when mainstream parties start to tolerate or to flirt with anti-democratic extremists, democracy gets into trouble. So thinking about the United States, Trump's authoritarianism is obviously a threat. But the greater threat may be the pervasive semi-loyalty that we increasingly see within the Republican Party. You have to remember, most Republican leaders were privately troubled by Trump's anti-democratic behavior in 20 and 21. But they enabled it anyway. They protected Trump and refused to impeach and convict him. They blocked the creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection. And most have now said they will back Trump in 2024, even if he were to have been convicted of overturning an election. Now, it actually doesn't have to be this way. If you compare the American experience to recent experiences in Brazil, you can see that there was actually another path possible. So let me talk for a moment about Brazil. So for several years, politics in Brazil and the United States, an unlikely pair perhaps, seem to have followed actually very parallel lines. Like in the US in 2018, Brazil elected a right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, who openly admired Trump. The New York Times described Bolsonaro as the Trump of the tropics. Like Trump, Bolsonaro lost his re-election bid and tried to overturn the results, just like Trump did. He did this in 2022, but his right-wing allies refused to go along with this. All of Brazil's leading conservative politicians publicly recognized Bolsonaro's defeat on election night. The president of Congress, leading senators, governors. Brazil even had its own January 6th-like event on January 8th, 2023, in which protesters stormed the Congress, the presidential palace, and the Supreme Court. But in Brazil, conservative politicians forcefully condemned the insurrection and backed a congressional investigation of it. No one downplayed it, no one condoned it, no one defended it. And finally, whereas Republicans have nominated Trump this year, despite his coup attempt, in Brazil, Bolsonaro has been barred for office for 8 years, and few right-wing politicians have rallied to his defense. So Trump today is a contender, viable contender for the presidency. Bolsonaro is an increasingly marginal figure in Brazil. So there was another path. Republicans simply didn't want to pursue it. So in the view of my co-author and I, Republican leaders' refusal to unambiguously accept the results of the election in 2021, their growing tolerance of political violence, and their willingness to support an openly authoritarian candidate are evidence of a party that's not completely committed to democratic rules and norms. So these are hard charges, and it raises an important question. Why is this happening? Well, how could it be that an established political party that's engaged in normal competitive democratic politics for more than a century would suddenly turn away from democratic politics? This is incredibly rare in history. And so in writing the book and researching the book, we were looking for other cases where this has happened, and it hasn't happened very often. We argue that the reason this has happened is fear of losing. For democracy to work, political parties have to be able to tolerate losing. And to tolerate losing, politicians and parties have to not believe that's going to bring ruinous consequences. When political parties or their constituents perceive that losing will pose an existential threat, they radicalize and often turn against democracy. We've actually seen this in American history before. This is what happened to the Democratic Party in the US after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era beginning in the 1870s. Reconstruction was America's first experiment with a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy. It brought widespread black enfranchisement. African Americans were a majority or near a majority in most southern states. But enfranchisement also terrified Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did black enfranchisement threaten Southern Democrats and their electoral dominance, it also threatened the entire racial order. For many Southern whites, this felt like an existential threat. So Democrats in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s responded by using violence and election fraud to seize power across Southern U.S. states. Then the Democratic Party entrenched itself in power after this by eviscerating African American voting rights. Unwilling to lose or to accept a multiracial democracy, Democrats established a system of essentially authoritarian rule in the U.S. South that would endure for nearly a century. Something similar, we fear, is potentially happening to the Republican Party today. Now, this may seem like an extreme example, but we have to remember that we've also now experienced a second attempt at multiracial democracy in the United States that began in the 1960s. The Civil Rights era, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s, generated resentment among many white voters, especially in the U.S. South. The Republican Party, in this point in time in the 1960s, was really a minority party. But white resentment over civil rights created an opportunity for the Republican Party. So beginning with Barry Goldwater in 1964 and continuing with Nixon and then Reagan, Republicans increasingly targeted white voters who were resentful over these cultural changes. And it worked. In a little over a generation, many Southerners flipped from being overwhelming Democrats in the U.S. South to being Republican. Republicans won the white vote in every presidential election after 1964. This helped them become the majority party. The Republicans won every presidential election between 1968 and 1988, except for the Watergate election of 1976. So the strategy worked, but it began to run into trouble because at the same time that the Republicans were becoming America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and Christian. The percentage of Americans who identified as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. This posed two significant threats to the Republican Party as it was constituent. The first was electoral. It became increasingly difficult for a white and Christian party to win national majorities in the 21st century. This is why the Republican Party has only won the popular vote for the presidency one time since 1988. And when I tell my daughters this, who are 15 and 14, I say one time since Taylor Swift was born. And then they get it. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote, which translated into a 44-state landslide election, 55% of the white vote. In 2012, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote, but still lost the election. But the threat went beyond losing elections. For parts of the Republican base, it felt existential. The U.S. is undergoing a transition that no other democracy has ever undergone, one in which a long dominant status group not only loses its majority electoral status, but also loses its dominant status in society. The perception that exists among many MAGA voters, the core of the Trump base, that the country they grew up in is being taken away from them, that is a powerful perception of existential threat, powerful enough to turn people away from democracy. Now, this radicalization of the Republican Party, its base, and some of its leaders would actually pose much less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies in which majorities actually govern. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at opinion polls across a whole range of topics, it's really actually very important to note that even on its best day, on its very best day, the MAGA Trump base of the Republican Party represents 30% of the American electorate. MAGA America has never represented a majority of Americans. And it's actually quite striking. This 30% faction is very similar to what's happening in most Western democracies. So as a scholar of comparative politics, and if you think about European democracies as well, I don't need to tell you this 30% figure is significant because it's this sort of range between 20 and 30% is a near constant across advanced democracies. Roughly 20 to 30% of voters in most established democracies are supportive of radical right or populist parties. If you look at the electoral base of the AfD, in Italy, in Sweden, the Netherlands, runs between 20 and sometimes even up to 30%. Yet in those places, to date, democracy has remained much more robust than it has in the United States. So my point here is what makes the U.S. distinctive, it's not its voters. It's not its voters. That's actually a broad similarity between Europe, Western Europe and the United States. It's our political institutions. And the problem chiefly lies in something that many of us, including myself, venerate, and that is the U.S. Constitution. Now, I need to emphasize here, the U.S. Constitution is a remarkable document. It should be protected, it should be defended, it should be appreciated. But there are certain features of our constitutional structures that protect and amplify political minorities. And when that political minority is authoritarian, this can be a danger for democracy. The Constitution at the time it was written, of course, was an incredibly revolutionary document, but it was crafted in a pre-democratic era. It was designed in part to protect against the tyranny of the majority, but it has generated the opposite problem. More so than any other democracy on earth, electoral majorities often cannot win power, and when they win power, they cannot govern. Now, some of you may be thinking, and I certainly think, that counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. And this is true, some of them are. It's true that democracy requires the protection of minority rights. Not everything should be up for grabs in an election. The U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson in the early 40s put it quite famously that some domains in political life must be placed beyond the reach of majorities. Beyond the reach of majorities. But I think there's not a sufficiently recognized point that not all counter-majoritarian institutions strengthen democracy. We must distinguish between what we might think of as good counter-majoritarian institutions that protect minorities and help preserve democracy, and ones that privilege minorities by granting them an unfair advantage, thereby subverting democracy. When I say minorities, I really mean here political minorities. So let me use an analogy that we use in our book. In a professional soccer match, rules that ensure fair competition or protect players by banning dangerous play and unfair play are essential. But in the same soccer match, rules that will allow one team to begin with a goal advantage or which would even award victory to a team even though it scores fewer points would obviously be considered unfair. Now, when it comes to a constitution, we can make similar kind of distinction. We try to do this in our book. So let me first talk about where counter-majoritarian institutions should operate. Where should there be limits on majorities? There's two domains in particular. The first is basic civil rights. Civil liberties like the right to speech, vote, freedom of association, religion, assembly, have to be protected from the whims of majorities. The second is the democratic process itself. Elected governments shouldn't be able to use majorities to entrench themselves in power, for example, by changing the rules of the game to weaken the opposition or outlaw the opposition, undermining fair competition. This is the classic problem of majority tyranny. This is what we saw in Chavez's Venezuela, we've seen in Orban's Hungary, and I think actually this is what Netanyahu was trying to do with his court reform proposals before October 7th. So we need mechanisms to protect the democratic system from majorities that would subvert it. Things like a Bill of Rights, things like judicial review, judicial independence. These are absolutely essential. These are essential for democracy. But again, here's the hitch. Not all counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. And so just as certain things have to be placed beyond the reach of majorities, in a democracy, certain parts of political life need to be within the reach of majorities. So I'll mention two. One is elections. Those with more votes should prevail over those with fewer votes in determining who holds political office. No theory of liberal democracy can justify any other outcome. So put differently, office holding should reflect how people vote. A second domain that should remain within the reach of majorities is legislatures. Those who win elections should be able to actually govern. Partisan minorities shouldn't be able to permanently veto regular legislation backed by parliamentary majorities, provided the legislation doesn't violate basic minority rights. So institutions that prevent electoral majorities from winning or parliamentary majorities from governing are not essential to democracy. They're actually arguably antithetical to democracy. Now, when we think about the United States, in a comparative perspective, comparing it to other countries around the world, it has an unusual number of these latter type of counter-majoritarian institutions. You know them all. The Electoral College allows the loser of the popular vote to win the presidency. A severely malapportioned Senate, which provides equal representation to Wyoming with 500,000 citizens and California with 40 million citizens, is a problem as well. The Senate filibuster, which allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by the majority on every piece of legislation. And finally, a powerful Supreme Court with extensive review powers, which allows justices appointed and with lifetime tenures, that's the distinctive point, which allows justices appointed in one generation to thwart majorities for generations to come. Now, I was always taught when I was an elementary school child and even into high school, that these institutions are part of a carefully calibrated system of checks and balances designed by far-sighted constitutional thinkers. And that is in part correct. Many of these institutions were, but many of these institutions were not part of a carefully calibrated plan. They are the result of compromise and improvisation of the founders in a very difficult founding moment. And those concessions and compromises built a bias into our political system that overrepresented eventually small and then eventually sparsely populated territories. The Electoral College, the U.S. Senate, and because the Senate confirms the president's nominees to the Supreme Court as well. Now, this rural bias in our institutions and our constitutional structure has nearly always been there. But it's never seriously advantaged one political party over another political party for most of our history because both of our two major parties had urban and rural wings. It's only in the 21st century that the U.S. parties have split along urban and rural lines, a split in which Democrats have become the party of densely populated areas, metropolitan centers, where Republicans are primarily the party of sparsely populated territories. So this rural bias now means the Republicans have a systematic advantage in the Senate and the Electoral College and the Supreme Court, which allows them to hold national power often without winning popular majorities. Now, this bias has three very specific consequences, so I'll just mention each of them. First, it gives rise to the misperception of partisan parity. Our politics looks like a dead heat at the national level, and both parties look as if they're stuck in a stalemate, alternating in power. But this isn't exactly correct, because in part, this is an institutionally engineered stalemate that is democratically unfair. So consider the presidency. Democrats have won the popular vote for the presidency, as I said, 7 out of the 8 last presidential elections. 7 out of the 8 last presidential elections since 1988. But Republicans have held the presidency for nearly half that time. Something similar is true in the U.S. Senate. U.S. senators are elected to staggered 6-year terms, with a third of the Senate being up for election every 2 years. So this means it takes 3 election cycles to fully, over a 6-year cycle, 3 elections over a 6-year cycle to fully renovate the Senate. In each of those cycles, Democrats have won the popular vote every time since 2000, and Republicans have controlled the Senate for half that time. And finally, the Supreme Court. 3 of our current Supreme Court justices were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and were confirmed by a Senate that didn't represent the winning party in national elections. So it's impossible to justify this balance, I would say, with any theory of democracy. So the system's democratically unfair. This is the first consequence. The second consequence is, to many Americans, the system is increasingly beginning to feel like minority rule. Policy preferences are increasingly out of sync with what our public policy looks like. So as we show in our book, there's overwhelming majorities of Americans who support more robust gun control, more robust policy efforts to address inequality and poverty, and abortion rights of the sort that were previously guaranteed by the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade. But now that disjuncture between what voters want and the policies we get increasingly there's a growing divide. Now that's due to many different things. It's not just due to our institutions, but our institutions are contributing to this in an important way by not allowing majorities to govern. And then the third consequence of this for our democracy, and it's in some sense, I think, an underappreciated consequence, is that our counter-majoritarian institutions, again, designed before political parties were even a thought in anybody's head. The word party doesn't appear in the U.S. Constitution, remember. These institutions are reinforcing Republican extremism by shielding the Republican Party at the national level from competitive pressure. Democratic competition is supposed to work something like a market. When a firm can't sell a product, it loses money. When a firm loses money, it comes under pressure to fire its managers, to come up with a new product, to find new customers. In democracies, parties are a little bit like this. Parties are supposed to win elections. When parties repeatedly lose elections, they're supposed to adapt and broaden their appeal. When the Democratic Party, back in the 1980s, lost 3 consecutive presidential elections, they moved to the center and picked Bill Clinton, a moderate, to run in 1992. Today, that process of adaptation isn't happening in the Republican parties. Republicans have repeatedly underperformed in presidential races and in midterm races. But so far, there's been no serious effort to moderate or rethink strategy. This is in part, we argue, because our institutions are giving the Republican Party an electoral crutch. So we call this constitutional protectionism. Republicans don't actually have to win national majorities. So extremism doesn't cost the party as it would in a truly competitive environment. If Republicans had to win national majorities to actually wield power, they'd face much greater pressure to rein in their extremism. This, we believe, is ultimately contributing to our democratic crisis. Now, my last point before concluding this evening is this, that minority rule, what I'm describing here is a kind of system of minority rule, is a distinctly American problem. In no other established democracy can partisan minorities thwart electoral majorities so consistently and as consequentially. Now, why is this the case? Well, in some ways, maybe I don't need to tell all of you this. This always comes particularly to American listeners as news. The kind of counter-majoritarianism that we have in the United States used to not be so unique in the world. It used to be widespread. 19th century European states had all sorts of undemocratic institutions, monarchical vetoes, indirect elections, unelected second chambers, badly malapportioned second chambers, filibuster-like mechanisms through which parliamentary minorities could thwart majorities. But over the course of the 20th century, other established democracies gradually dropped their pre-democratic institutions. Britain weakened its House of Lords, stripping it of its veto power. Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Portugal got rid of their undemocratic upper chambers altogether. Germany democratized its second chamber by making it slightly more proportional to population. Britain, Canada, Australia, France, and other countries established cloture rules which eliminated this kind of filibuster-like mechanism where debate could continue on requiring supermajorities in legislatures. Germany, Switzerland, France imposed term limits on justices. The United Kingdom, Canada, Sweden, other democracies established retirement ages for justices. And every other presidential democracy on earth got rid of its Electoral College. Argentina was the last in 1994. So other democracies have become more democratic over the last century, eliminating 18th and 19th century institutions that allowed minorities to systematically thwart majorities. The US simply has just not done the same. So today, the United States is the only presidential democracy on earth with an Electoral College. We have the most malapportioned Senate in the world except for Argentina and Brazil. No other democracy allows a congressional minority to routinely veto regular legislation that's backed by a majority. And the US is the only established democracy with truly lifetime appointments for Supreme Court justices. Every other democracy has either retirement ages or term limits. So the US on each of these dimensions is an outlier. Taken together, the US is uniquely counter-majoritarian, and we contend that this explains, at least in part, why American democracy seems to be uniquely threatened among old, rich democracies. Now, I said at the beginning we wrote this book because we wanted to know how do we get out of this mess. I haven't said a word about that yet. So that's what the last comments I'll make. So in our book, we propose 15 suggestions for democratic reform because we think that in large part, our institutions have these problems. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole list of 15 proposals right now, but just to give you some of the highlights: entrenching voting rights and making it easier to vote. There's a whole series of reforms one can do this. Replace the Electoral College with direct presidential elections. Democratize the Senate by eliminating the filibuster, which doesn't require a constitutional amendment. Expanding the House of Representatives. I know in Germany the Bundestag is totally unwieldy. The US hasn't expanded its Congress since the 1920s. In 100 years, expanding the House of Representatives, establishing term limits for Supreme Court justices. This is not a random list. The common thread is we need to make it easier for majorities. In the United States, not in all democracies, but in the United States at least. You know, each country, different reforms are going to be necessary for different problems. In the United States, the problem is majorities can't govern. So we believe that reforms to make it easier for majorities to govern are essential. Now, this is a long-run agenda. None of this stuff is going to happen before November 2024. So anybody who's worried about what's going to happen in November 2024, this is not going to satisfy you. So I also want to make the case, as we do in our book, that we need to think short-term as well. And the short-term strategy is to focus on building big, broad, heterogeneous often coalitions from left to right, from Liz Cheney to AOC on the Democratic Socialist left, among political leaders, civil society organizations, religious organizations, business organizations who all share a commitment to democracy. So back in the 1990s, Trump's role model of Viktor Orban was elected prime minister. He was voted out of office after one term. 8 years later, he won again, vowing to never lose another election. So far, he's kept that promise. How did he get back into office? In large part, a fractured opposition, democratic opposition that feared him, but that despised each other so much, and with so much infighting that he got back in the door. Now, my concern in the short run is that in the United States, we risk doing the same thing. The whole series of issues, including foreign policy issues, the Israel-Hamas war, that may divide America's democratic opposition. In my own view, all other issues must be put to the side to support a broad coalition that's committed to democracy. So this means no third-party voting. This means not vote, if you can vote, staying at home is not an option. So this is the short run. But I want to come back to this last point because each national election will continue to feel like a national emergency. A democracy can't be a system in which if one side loses, democracy goes to hell, right? We need a system in which there can be alternations in power. So each national election will feel like a national emergency unless we also think long-term. And one of the long-term ailments of our democracy, as I've made the case this evening, are institutions. And so democratizing our institutions are essential, and having a commitment to and keeping on the public agenda the idea of institutional reform is essential. Because if we don't think about these things, we risk losing our democracy, and too much is at stake. Thank you.
You're right, okay. think. Oh. Yeah. Are we right?
Just going to twist the mic. Yeah.
Okay. So you all have to get the book to get the whole list. All right, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions to start, and then you can send your questions. Oh boy, we have a lot already. Very good. Thank you, guys. I wanted to open the way you ended, actually, with the Electoral College. You spoke quite a bit about it, but one of the things that came up in our book group, which I found very interesting, it wasn't apparent to any of us that the Electoral College was never a problem until George W. Bush.
Yeah, so it's this problem of one side winning the popular vote and losing the Electoral College vote has happened before. Happened back in the 1870s. Actually, exactly 200 years ago, there was a tie in the Electoral College, which, if you had a popular vote, the probability of a tie would be, minimal, right? Now, 1824, there was a tie, which threw the system into crisis. So I guess there's 2 points. One, that it's potentially unfair. It seems to be happening more. It could happen again in 2024. Mm-hmm. And I think the more frequently that it happens, and if it keeps happening in the same direction, I think it really poses problems of legitimacy. I mean, again, think of somebody, born who could vote for the first time in the year 2000. If this happens again, this will have happened 3 times in their lifetime. This begins to kind of say the system's not, there's a problem. But I guess the other point I would make is that it's a very cumbersome system, that even leaving aside the fairness question, this process of voting and then waiting from November until January, and there's each of these steps where the electors have to gather, and they have to, the whole thing that this effort to overturn the vote in 2020 and 2021 revealed all of these weaknesses of this system. And those are all still there. And so that's why we've had these kind of moments throughout in 1824, 1876, 2000, 2020, possibly 2024, where the system is just very fraught and vulnerable, has all these kind of crevices where people can engage in monkey business.
If it stays at monkey business, we're good.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. One of the questions from the audience I find very good. I am also of the ilk. I always get in trouble, but I can't understand why we have 2 Dakotas. 4 senators.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But there are others who disagree with me, and how would you reply to Republicans that say Democrats wouldn't be experiencing these institutional limitations if they hadn't abandoned or lost the rural vote?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Alexander Hamilton, as they were just debating whether to give, how much power to give states and so on, and there were the people from small states, Delaware at that time, were saying, small states need more representation, and Alexander Hamilton said, we have to remember who we're fighting for. Who has rights? Is it individuals or these phantom beings called states? I understand being in Bavaria saying that may be kind of entering into dangerous terrain, but German federalism in some ways deals with the same issue. But in a democracy, individuals have rights, and when people say, well, Democrats can't win the rural areas, Democrats have won the majority of the vote, again, every time, except for once since 1988. I keep repeating that statistic. And so, so it's possible for Democrats to win. They sometimes win. But if the playing field's tilted, if you're playing a basketball game and one side has to score on a 12-foot hoop and the other on a 10-foot hoop, the person playing uphill or playing on the 12-foot can sometimes win if they do really well. But that's not a particularly fair system. And so in order for, the people have done these analyses where in 2020, in order to really guarantee that Biden win, he had to win 52% of the vote. In order for Republicans to win, they had to win 47% of the vote. That's not a partisan statement to say that that's not fair.
Yeah. No, and it comes down to very few states deciding the election.
Yeah, that's right. And there's that issue
as well.
Yeah.
Where people, in Hawaii, you have to, anyway.
And so, and just to say that you said that people weren't paying attention before, and I think part of it is that previously, since both Republicans and Democrats had urban and rural wings, and this is driven not really by electoral strategy, often by demographic change and changing where people live, and the realignment of the U.S. South. We just didn't know. It was unfair, but it wasn't as noticeable. But now it's increasingly noticeable, and it's unfair. And the nature, as we've seen in Hungary, when one party is able to entrench itself in power using institutions, then they thwart competition, and this can undermine democracy. So it's not a partisan point. It's a concern that if one side keeps winning over and over, that can become a problem. Democrats could win the countryside too. That wouldn't help. That wouldn't hurt. I mean, just to. Don't want to concede that.
I think they might this time.
Yeah, right. No,
if people become issues voters and not partisan
tribal
voters.
I'm not really a Democratic Party strategist. I mean, if I were a Democratic Party strategist, I'd say figure out how to win in the countryside, sure. But I'm sort of making a comment more about the state of democracy.
Well, I mean, Kansas showed us that they can vote very Democratic if abortion is on the ballot, for example.
Right. Yeah.
So, who, in your opinion, should set these non-negotiable rules that cannot be changed by majorities, like freedom of speech, right to vote, et cetera, in the first place?
Yeah, so I sort of tried to make it seem very simple, these clear principles, civil liberties, democratic process itself. What is up for contention is what count as the essential civil liberties and how those get defined. Having the Second Amendment and having access to guns, is that a core liberty? Is bodily autonomy a policy, and abortion rights, is this a policy issue, or is this a fundamental right? These kinds of things will always be debated, but this is it's a consensual process. I mean, I think there are some core values and principles and rights for which there's broad consensus: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. How one defines those can also be up for debate. So I don't think we have a full answer to that, but. At least what I'm trying to do is provide some kind of framework to decide where majorities should govern and where they shouldn't. Courts have often played this role in the United States, but there's inevitably, I mean, as what's happened with abortion rights is increasingly being decided by legislative majorities as well.
It's hard to compare, since we're in Germany, I'm going to do one German question because I found this fascinating in your book and I thought it might be interesting to talk about. It's hard to compare the political systems in the US and Germany directly, but you know both systems very well. And in 2018, you called for a complete overhaul of the GOP using Germany's CDU as a model for New Republican. Do you still think so today? And do you want to explain that?
Yeah, well, so I wrote a book. Before I wrote these two books, I wrote this much longer book that took many more years to write that nobody has ever read. Encourage you to all read it, on the history of, I mean, some people read it. So, but on 19th century and 20th century British and German conservatives. And so I was very interested in the fate of German conservatism in the 19th century. And I think German conservatives in the late 19th century, or before World War I, in a way played obviously a very destructive role for democracy. They represented a minority, landed elites, Prussian landed elites. They had a kind of iron grip of minority rule on the political system, and they thwarted democracy. And so the remarkable achievement, of course, after 1945, or at least from my view, in part, is the transformation of the right end of the political spectrum. And so the creation of the CDU was a great achievement and a necessary precondition for German democracy. Of course, the trauma of the Holocaust, of war, seems to have been, this is what preceded this. That's obviously not what I wish upon the United States, right? So, I mean, part of the point of writing a book like this and sort of trying to spread the message on it is to say we can learn from history so that we don't have to go through this trauma ourselves. So I think the idea of a party fundamentally remaking itself, some people will sometimes say, well, this is unrealistic. The Republicans are never going to change it. And it is, I understand that. It does seem unrealistic. But the reality is in a democracy, that's all we have at our disposal. I mean, a democracy requires two parties to compete and win, whether it's the Republican Party or some other party. Having a party of the right, of the center right, or of the right, a constitutional party of the right, is probably going to be necessary, whether it's called the Republican Party or not. And so the question is, how do we get there? And sort of really the purpose of this book is to say, we can't just sort of sit around waiting for it to happen. I think these institutional reforms, the idea of these institutions, usually the way that this happens in a democracy, the genius of democracy, is that it's supposed to be self-correcting. You lose, and when you lose in a devastating, repeated fashion, you learn. You draw the right lessons.
But it's not happening.
But it's not happening. And I think the way that you get it to happen is you need to change the institutions to provide the incentives for politicians to begin to realize. Who's the we to change our institutions? Well, the constitutional amendment process requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states. Now, there's a great American tradition that we, Americans, have given up on. Throughout the reason the Constitution is such a great document is in part because it's been amended so many, the women's
Not in my
enfranchisement.
lifetime, exactly.
Right, that's right. Women's enfranchisement, the direct election of U.S. senators, the abolition of slavery. I mean, so after the Civil War, at the beginning of the 20th century, the progressive movement carried out a major series of reforms, the introduction of income tax. All of these things require constitutional amendment. The 1960s, we didn't have constitutional amendments. We had a series of major democratic reforms. Really, since the 1970s, we've kind of forgotten how to do this.
The ERA, and it never
we've
happened.
sort of forgotten how to do this and given up on it. And so we're kind of engaged in this radical experiment of not improving our democracy. And I think you can see what's happened. So again, part of the point of the book is to try to remind people that there has been this tradition. It's a steep hill to climb. But you have to remember, in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. senators, 2/3 of U.S. senators who were sitting in the U.S. Senate in the early part of the 20th century, many of them had been elected indirectly, had to vote to eliminate the system that had gotten them to power. And so I think it is possible to carry out constitutional reform. How does it come about? I mean, this usually comes through broad social mobilization and social pressure, where politicians think it's in their interest to do it.
So call your representative?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the female suffrage movement took generations, unfortunately, right? But this is the kind of thing that needs to happen. I do imagine the Electoral College, I could imagine a scenario in which the reform of the Electoral College is more likely than we might think. First of all, as we describe in the book, in 1970.
I was just going to say, big topic. Who knew? It almost happened.
Yes,
right. I mean, who knew? I didn't know.
Yeah, no, it's in 1970, got the 2/3 majority in the House. Richard Nixon was in favor of getting rid of the Electoral College, which maybe is not a ringing endorsement, but the
lost opportunity.
Yeah, the Chamber of Commerce, the American Bar Association, the AFL-CIO, the largest labor union. So this was broad societal consensus.
And then
it came to the Senate. It had a majority of support in the Senate, but didn't reach the 2/3 majority. So this has almost happened, and I could imagine a scenario in which a state like Texas, let's say, which is an overwhelming, which is a large state, Republican state, becomes a Democratic state. You could imagine a couple of presidential elections as it becomes more diverse, becomes a purple, bluish state. Suddenly, Republicans would think to themselves, all the electors from Texas go to Democrats. Republicans might think to themselves, wouldn't it be nice to have all of these Republican voters voting for a popularly elected Republican? California, similarly, is a massive state with many, many Republicans, more than any other state, maybe except for Texas. And these are all wasted votes for Republicans. So you could imagine a situation where if the states go a different direction, where suddenly Republicans start to get on board with the idea of changing the Electoral College.
Oh, that's interesting. That's hopeful.
Yeah.
Let's see. 7 people want me to ask. You said that judicial review is necessary for democracy. How can this be true if many democracies, the UK, Netherlands, and Norway, don't have judicial review?
Well, but by that I mean that some system of guaranteeing individual rights and liberties. Some role for judicial independence. I mean, this is something that's come to most democracies in the post-war period. Independent courts are not always good for democracy. I mean, they've served in destructive ways also in American history in the 19th century, helping reinforce Jim Crow and so on. Mm-hmm. But we need some kind of system we see the limits of having independent judiciaries, I would say, the best testament to the importance of independent judiciaries is what Viktor Orban has tried to do, the judiciary, or has done to the judiciary in Hungary, what the Law and Justice Party tried to do in Poland, and what Netanyahu was trying to do in Israel. So I think there's a critical role for some kind of other institution to work against a kind of overly powerful majority. So it's a useful institution.
Okay. Here's one that also came up in the book credit. Do you feel the general population understands what is at stake currently, or are they underestimating the danger to democracy? That could have the same in Europe.
Yeah. Well, I think people. On the one hand, I'm pretty optimistic because I do think when you see these statistics, let's say from Turingen, where 30% of people want to vote for the AfD, you have to remember 70% of people are not, right? So similarly, I think in the United States, Donald Trump never won a majority of the vote. He never has had, in any opinion poll in his life, has had a majority of Americans supporting him. So I think most Americans, most Europeans are broadly committed, sort of quite vaguely, to kind of principles of pluralism, liberalism, democracy. So I think, and I think people, but it's exhausting work defending democracy, right? People get tired of just going about their lives. So one of the things, and I find this particularly with my students, is that, I don't think of myself as an old person. My hairline tells a different story. But, when I talk to my students, I kind of realize there's a generational divide in the sense that, this argument that we need to protect our democracy sounds like protecting the status quo. And the status quo isn't working out so well. And so I think the point is that we need to do more than offer a kind of vision of just protecting, 1990s American democracy. And so, there has to be a more positive vision of what can be achieved. And I think that's part of what is lacking. And I think the US does have the opportunity, and West European democracies do as well, of a kind of multi-ethnic democracy that's inclusive, broad, where there's rights of political equality guaranteed to individuals of all backgrounds. This is a kind of new achievement. And so this is something that I think people can get behind as a kind of, it's not just defending the status quo. So that's one point. A second point is, I think it's really important to understand how the everyday policy issues that affect people's lives, things such as abortion rights, things such as gun control in the United States, how they link to democracy. So people don't get excited. I get excited about malapportionment of the Senate. Most people don't. Average citizens don't. But if you can link this to the things that affect people's lives, and that's really, I think, an important political agenda, then people do care about democracy.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I also think that in America, people are not paying attention yet. Most people. Yeah. I mean, I'm a junkie, but I think most people will start paying attention in September.
Yeah.
Because it's exhausting.
But it is true, that, so when this story came out about this Remigration meeting in Potsdam, and Germans came out into the streets, and this was a kind of remarkable moment where business, people who, it wasn't just the usual people in the streets, people who had never participated. I've had people tell, I've never participated in a protest march in my life, and I was participating in this. So this mobilization in Germany, I found inspiring, having, League of German Bishops and German business and labor unions making broad statements. This kind of thing hasn't happened so far in the United States. And I hope that it would, because it's a sign of resilience, where you just at least normatively are kind of saying, here's the red line, and it begins to fade, you repaint the red line. See, beyond this kind of behavior, it's not acceptable. Mm-hmm. That really hasn't happened so far this year. I mean, it's partly because there's a Democrat in the White House, and people sort of, I think things should be under control, but some of the proposals that have been coming out sound very similar to the proposals that were being discussed at that Potsdam meeting.
The proposals from
the
Heritage.
From the Heritage
2025.
Yes. Sending Homeland Security into blue states, going door to door, asking people for their citizenship papers, and if they can't find them, taking them out.
For people who maybe aren't junkies like we are, it's the advisors to the Republican Party have put together a policy paper, and it's black and white what they want to do, and it's all very authoritarian.
Yeah, it's unclear, whether there's going to be pushback against it and so on. But the proposals themselves, I think most Americans sort of think, well, it's the classic kind of thing. I'm a citizen, so I don't have anything to worry about. But of course, when Homeland Security shows up at your house, if you have, as you all know, there's no IDs in the United States, right? You don't have an Ausweis. If you don't have a passport, it's kind of difficult to show if you're a citizen or not. So this kind of arbitrariness and the threats of this are, is pretty frightening.
I also still think, I was just in Arizona last week, which is a very interesting state. I think there's a lot of, it won't happen here.
Right.
And I say, tell that to the women in Texas who are bleeding out in their cars. It is happening. But it feels to most people like, they're not going to take away Social Security.
Yeah.
If they say they're going to do it.
Yeah. There's a risk. There's at least a probability that's significant.
Yeah, there is a risk. So, 7 people. Why do you think the Republican Party radicalized? You sort of talked about this. It's the fear of losing, right? Why didn't it choose another path of trying to convince or win the majority instead of more afraid of losing power?
Well, so there was this moment, and we recount this in the book, after 2012, the Barack Obama victory in 2012, where the Republican Party issued this thing called the autopsy, when there were some Republican leaders who decided, we need to be obviously more appealing they realized America's becoming more diverse, we're not winning vote among Hispanic voters, among female voters, and there was a proposal to kind of change the profile of the party. They kind of proposed this, they issued all these proposals to do this, and then it didn't, by 2016, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, all of the people running for president were kind of running on this as their vision. Jeb Bush would speak Spanish on the campaign trail, and his wife is born in Mexico, I think. So, but they were defeated by the Republican base. And so in 2016, Donald Trump put an end to that vision.
Yeah. We haven't even talked about the media landscape in the United States. It's different than in Europe.
Yes. Yes, I think, we don't spend a lot of time in the book on that, but I do think that is, certainly so. I mean, the political science research on this shows that, people have been doing a lot of work on this, showing how if you listen to the same news, you pay in these experiments, they'll pay people to listen to, they'll ask them what their political views are, pay them for 2 months to listen to only news or look at news sites that are connected on their side of the aisle, and and then you poll them, ask them questions later, and it radicalizes people on the right and the left. So the social media landscape certainly is polarizing. I mean, we all know this, I think. One thing that I do, I often will point out is that the kind of role of public media in Germany and in Europe in general really plays an important role.
Yeah.
And kind of having a higher level of discourse. Of course, there's not all media looks like this. Not everybody listens to public radio and public television, but it nonetheless shapes debate and raises the level of journalism, I think, in a way that's really very useful.
Yeah, I agree with that. We have time for a couple more, because we do have a book table. He will be signing books afterwards. Why and how were other Western democracies able to successfully improve their democratic systems in the last decades, and what has been holding the U.S. back? That's broad.
I mean, why is the U.S. being held back? I would say that, there have been many efforts. There's been thousands of efforts to amend the U.S. Constitution. It's only been amended 27 times, 10 times right after the founding. So really only 17 times. There's been thousands of efforts. And really there's two things. One, that it's just very difficult. The U.S. Constitution is the hardest constitution in the world to change. I mean, people who've tried to quantify this, looking at 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. It's incredibly difficult. Constitutions should be hard to change. Thomas Jefferson famously thought there should be a new constitution, essentially every few decades or something. I think this is not quite right. I mean, constitutions should be hard to change, so that, when you have constitutions that are too easy to change, you have the problem of highly politicized institutions. But the U.S. is sort of on the other extreme. So that's one problem. But there's a second issue, as I've said, because we have changed the Constitution, that Americans simply have forgotten that they can do it. I mean, I think it's something that's not part of the public consciousness, and we sort of lost the constitutional imagination. And so I think this is partly because it's difficult, but also because of high levels of polarization, and people have just sort of stopped talking about it. I mean,
it hasn't happened in the lifetime of most people.
That's right. And so it's really, there was a period where and that's partly why we wrote the book, is to sort of try to normalize this. I mean, there were people writing books on this, but they were, if you're a professor saying we need to get rid of the Electoral College, you're kind of regarded as, an oddball. Journalists don't want to write about it. Teachers don't want to talk about it. And the quickest road to the defeat of an idea is to not even talk about it. And so that, again, is, I think, a big part of the story.
Yeah. Whistle-stop tour about amending the Constitution.
Right. That's right.
Okay.
And I should say, though, that there's two ways to amend the Constitution. One is through a constitution, according to our Constitution. One is through a constitutional convention, which has never been done at the national level. And the other is through this cumbersome process. I'm a big opponent of the idea of calling a constitutional convention. I mean, this is something that I think would be a disaster. I think this kind of incremental process of working through these steps of changing it through the House and the Senate and the other states, I mean, this is the road to follow.
Okay. Aside from democratic reform, do you see any scenarios in which the Republican Party freely abandons Trumpism and re-embraces democracy or democratic principles before the end of the decade? Here's your crystal ball.
Yeah. So the only people worse than economists at making predictions are political scientists. No, but I do think that the pathway to adaptation is losing. I mean, this is the great advantage democracies have over authoritarian systems. There's uneven evidence of whether their economic growth is better, social peace. I mean, some scholars show that democracies are better. Other scholars show authoritarian systems are better. We can think of China. We can think of Singapore. One of the big advantages democracy have over authoritarian systems is we can throw our leaders out. And this sends a signal to politicians that they need to change course. And so this is the genius of democracy. But if we have a system in which that mechanism is not really working, then it's harder, and I think that's the problem that we face. So, I think if Trump loses, and there was a landslide election in 2024 and another one in 2028, I could imagine at that point the Republican Party realizing that they're on the wrong track. But we have to recognize that there's a strong base pushing in the other direction. I mean, the way, we haven't talked much about this, but the way that election districts are drawn, really homogeneous
the
gerrymandering, right, where you have highly Republican districts where, and this is a problem for Democrats as well as Republicans. Both parties face this problem where the number of competitive seats has declined dramatically over the last 30 years. And so, if you're a Republican member of Congress, the thought that you're going to lose to a Democrat, this really is not much of a concern for most Republicans.
It's primaries.
So they're worried about being primaries. And so this is on the left and the right, this has the effect of pushing, even if there's nobody running in a primary, just the prospect that somebody might run in a primary means that politicians kind of have to keep an eye on their left and their right kind of shoulders. And I think this is also contributing to the kind of radicalization. So one of the proposals that we have in the book is which some states have done, which is to introduce independent commissions to draw election districts, which will allow for fair competition in election districts. And I think this would have a de-radicalizing effect as well.
Do you know which states have done that off the top of your head?
California has.
Okay.
And the evidence seems to be that it does have not a huge effect, but a kind of moderating effect.
Yeah.
So these independent commissions, rather than having the state legislatures drawing districts, so New York is a state that hasn't done this, and so on the Democratic side, where the state legislature was dominated by Democrats, they redrew these districts in such a way that to allow themselves even more victories, and it was so egregious that the court came in and forced them to redraw the districts. Wisconsin famously has not had this, and so Republicans in Pennsylvania as well, even though they lose the popular vote at the state legislative level because of the way districts are drawn, Republicans have been able to win supermajorities in some cases. California is a state, and there's several others as well that have introduced these independent commissions, which just are a fairer drawing of districts. Races are more competitive, and you get beginning to see some signs of moderation.
Okay. All right. We have to close. I have one more question. There's so many more questions here. I'm very sorry we didn't get to everything, but I also respect our online audience. It's getting a bit long. I could go on forever. I think maybe you could come back.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you.
I do have one last question. I do have one last question before I have a couple of things I need to say. You wrote this a year ago, 2 years ago.
No, a year
ago.
Yeah, over the last couple of years, yeah.
What still makes you anxious, and does anything give you hope?
Well, what still makes me anxious is that, you sort of always think that, okay, well, we've reached the point where people now see how bad things are, and there hasn't been change. I would think one thing that makes me anxious, more anxious than when we wrote the book, is the role of the Supreme Court. There's this case going on in New York, which is, whatever, it's sort of a funny case. Funny in that it's not a serious kind of violation that Trump engaged in there. The investigation of Trump's role on January 6th has essentially been halted by the Supreme Court as they've considered the possibility that the president might be immune, or to what degree is a president immune from any criminal investigations. Rather than proceeding rapidly with this to allow for voters to know how this case had proceeded, it's dragged it out at each step of the way. And I think in large part, I don't think that the court is in the back pocket of Trump, but the court really doesn't want to get its fingers dirty and somehow be implicated in the election, and so doesn't want to make a decision before the November elections. I think this is, it's a case the court is considering to consider whether or not the president is immune. By delaying it, they're in effect making the president immune potentially. Right. And so that makes me very worried. So the possibility that the role of the Supreme Court in American politics is very worrying because it's tilted 6-3. If Trump wins in 2024, and these people are going to be in these positions for their lives. So this is not a decision about 2024. This is a decision about for the next 30 years. So that makes me very worried. What makes me hopeful is, I always stop and remind myself that majorities of Americans don't like this stuff. Majorities of Americans, looking at, if you really dig into opinion poll and data, there's been a dramatic transformation in Americans' embrace of living in a diverse society. If you look at opinion polls in the 1970s, the same questions have been asked over a generation. You know, there was a question that was routinely asked, you know, do you support laws that prohibit racial discrimination in the selling of homes? This is something that majorities of Americans didn't support in the 1970s. Today, overwhelming majorities of Americans support this kind of thing. So Americans are much more tolerant in terms of racial grounds and political equality for people of all backgrounds. And then generationally, younger Americans are even more so. So I think in general, American attitudes are more tolerant, more supportive of liberal, inclusive democracy. And so we just need to allow those majorities to speak.
That seems like a very good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.